Welcome, traveller of time, to tonight's gentle descent into the quiet corners of history. Whether you're resting after a long day or simply seeking a moment of calm, I'm grateful to have you here. Do let me know where you're listening from and what hour it is for you. I imagine us as glowing dots on a spinning globe, connected by curiosity and the hush of night. And if this peaceful storytelling brings a little stillness to your day, feel free to subscribe. We'll have many more historical tales to share. In this video, I'm going to take you on a journey through the absolute nightmare that was Viking medicine and surgery. We'll explore the bone-chilling procedures that somehow passed for healthcare, the horrifying tools they used to perform these operations, and the mind-boggling misconceptions about the human body that guided their every decision. But first, let me give you some context about just how brutal this world really was, because what you're about to learn will change everything you thought you knew about medieval medicine. Now, before we dive into the gore, let me establish my credentials here. I've spent the last 2 years researching medieval medical practices, poring over archaeological evidence, and consulting with historians who specialize in Viking culture. I've examined actual surgical tools recovered from burial sites, studied runic inscriptions that describe medical procedures, and even interviewed modern surgeons about what these ancient operations would have actually felt like. The research for this video took over 200 hours, and I can honestly say that some of the things I discovered kept me awake at night. But here's what makes this even more fascinating. These weren't just random acts of medieval barbarism. The Vikings actually believed they were practicing sophisticated medicine. They had their own complex understanding of anatomy, their own theories about disease, and their own systematic approaches to treatment. The problem is, almost everything they believed was completely wrong, and their attempts to help often resulted in unimaginable suffering. So what exactly made Viking medicine so horrifying? Well, imagine if you took everything we know about modern surgery, threw it out the window, and replaced it with a combination of superstition, guesswork, and techniques that would make a medieval torturer blush. That's essentially what we're dealing with here. The first thing you need to understand is that Vikings had absolutely no concept of germs, bacteria, or infection. None whatsoever. They lived in a world where disease was caused by evil spirits, curses from angry gods, or imbalances in the body's natural humors. This meant that their approach to treating wounds and performing surgery was based on principles that were not just wrong, but catastrophically dangerous. When a Viking warrior came back from battle with a serious injury, the first step wasn't to clean the wound or assess the damage. Instead, the local healer would typically begin by trying to determine which god or supernatural force had caused the injury in the first place. They might consult runes, examine the entrails of sacrificed animals, or perform elaborate rituals to appease whatever divine entity they believed was responsible for the warrior's suffering. Only after these spiritual considerations were addressed would they actually begin treating the physical wound, and that's where things got truly nightmarish. Viking surgical instruments were crude, unsterilized, and often repurposed from other activities. We're talking about knives that were used for butchering animals, needles made from fish bones, and saws that were originally designed for woodworking. The idea of having dedicated medical instruments that were kept clean and sharp specifically for surgery was completely foreign to them. But the tools were just the beginning of the horror show. The actual procedures themselves were exercises in medieval brutality that would make your worst dental experience look like a relaxing spa day. Take trepanation, for example, which was one of the most common surgical procedures in Viking society. This involved drilling or scraping holes directly into a patient's skull, supposedly to release evil spirits or relieve pressure on the brain. Now, you might think that drilling holes in someone's head sounds bad enough, but the Viking approach to trepanation was particularly gruesome. They would typically use a crude metal drill or a sharp stone tool, and the procedure would be performed without any form of anesthesia, beyond whatever alcohol they could force down the patient's throat. The patient would be held down by several strong men while the healer slowly bored through their skull, often taking hours to complete the process. The sound alone must have been absolutely horrifying. Imagine the grinding, scraping noise of metal against bone, combined with the patient's screams of agony, echoing through whatever crude shelter they were using as an operating room. And remember, this was considered advanced medical care at the time. This was what passed for sophisticated surgery in Viking society. But here's where it gets even worse. The Vikings believed that the success of the operation depended not just on the physical procedure, but on maintaining the proper spiritual atmosphere throughout the surgery. This meant that the operation might be accompanied by chanting, ritual sacrifices, or other ceremonial activities that could extend the procedure for hours beyond what was medically necessary. And if you think trepanation sounds bad, wait until you hear about their approach to treating internal injuries. When a Viking warrior suffered damage to their organs, the healers would often decide that the only way to save the patient was to open them up and physically manipulate the damaged tissue. This meant cutting through the abdomen or chest cavity with whatever sharp instruments they had available, reaching inside the body with unwashed hands, and attempting to repair organs using techniques that were based more on butchering animals than on any understanding of human anatomy. The mortality rate for these procedures was astronomical. We're talking about success rates that were so low that surviving Viking surgery was essentially a miracle. Most patients died either during the operation from blood loss and shock, or in the days following from massive infections that their immune systems had no hope of fighting off. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Viking medicine wasn't the crude surgical techniques or the unsanitary conditions. It was their complete misunderstanding of how the human body actually worked. Vikings believed that illness and injury were caused by supernatural forces, which meant that their treatments were often designed to address spiritual problems rather than physical ones. For example, if a warrior developed what we would now recognize as appendicitis, the Viking healer might conclude that the patient had been cursed by an enemy or had somehow offended the gods. The treatment might involve elaborate purification rituals, the consumption of various herbal concoctions, or even the sacrifice of animals to appease whatever supernatural entity was believed to be causing the illness. Meanwhile, the patient's appendix would be slowly rupturing inside their body, spreading infection throughout their abdominal cavity, and the delay in proper treatment would virtually guarantee their death. But from the Viking perspective, they were providing the most advanced medical care available, following procedures that had been passed down through generations of healers. This brings us to one of the most chilling aspects of Viking medicine: the absolute confidence with which these healers approached their work. They weren't experimenting or trying new techniques. They were following established medical traditions that they believed were proven and effective. They had no doubt that their methods were correct, which meant that they would persist with treatments that were clearly making patients worse, convinced that they just needed to try harder or perform the rituals more precisely. The archaeological evidence for Viking medical practices is both fascinating and horrifying. We've found surgical instruments in burial sites that show clear evidence of use, including bone saws with human tissue still embedded in the teeth, and knives that have been worn down from repeated cutting through human flesh. We've also discovered skulls that show evidence of trepanation, some with multiple holes drilled at different times, suggesting that patients survived the initial procedure, only to undergo it again later. But perhaps most disturbing are the skeletal remains that show evidence of surgical procedures that were clearly unsuccessful. We've found bones that were sawed partway through and then abandoned, suggesting that the patient died during the operation. We've discovered skulls where the trepanation hole was drilled in completely the wrong location, missing the actual site of injury by several inches. And we've uncovered evidence of amputations that were performed so crudely that the remaining bone was left jagged and splintered, guaranteeing that the wound would never heal properly. These archaeological findings paint a picture of medical practice that was not just primitive, but actively harmful. Viking healers were essentially performing experimental surgery on living patients, with no understanding of anatomy, no concept of infection control, and no effective methods for managing pain or preventing shock. And yet, despite all of this, Viking society continued to rely on these medical practices for centuries. Warriors would submit to these horrific procedures rather than face certain death from their injuries, and families would pay substantial sums to have their loved ones treated by the most skilled healers available. The fact that most patients died anyway didn't seem to shake their faith in the system, partly because death was such a common part of Viking life that high mortality rates probably seemed normal. The social dynamics around Viking medicine were also deeply disturbing. Healers held positions of significant power and respect in Viking society, despite the fact that their treatments were more likely to kill patients than cure them. They were often consulted on important political and military decisions, and their opinions carried weight far beyond their actual medical knowledge. This created a situation where incompetent medical practitioners were not only tolerated but actually revered, and where questioning their methods was considered not just disrespectful but potentially dangerous. A warrior who refused treatment from a respected healer might be seen as cowardly or lacking in faith, while a family member who questioned a healer's diagnosis might be accused of interfering with divine will. The economic aspects of Viking medicine were equally troubling. Healing was often an expensive proposition, requiring payment not just for the healer's services, but also for the various materials and sacrificial animals that were considered necessary for successful treatment. This meant that wealthy Vikings had access to more elaborate and supposedly more effective treatments, while poor Vikings had to make do with whatever basic care they could afford. But here's the twisted irony. The more expensive treatments were often more dangerous than the basic ones. Wealthy patients might undergo complex surgical procedures with multiple healers in attendance, elaborate ritual preparations, and expensive imported medicines, all of which increase the chances of something going wrong. Poor patients who received simpler treatments with fewer interventions might actually have had better survival rates simply because there were fewer opportunities for medical errors. The training of Viking healers was another source of horror. There were no medical schools, no standardized curricula, and no system for ensuring that healers actually knew what they were doing. Instead, medical knowledge was passed down through informal apprenticeships, often within families, where incorrect techniques and dangerous misconceptions were perpetuated from generation to generation. A young person who wanted to become a healer might spend years learning procedures that were not just ineffective, but actively harmful, and they would have no way of knowing that their training was inadequate. They would practice on real patients, learning through trial and error, with the errors often resulting in unnecessary deaths. This system virtually guaranteed that Viking medical practice would remain primitive and dangerous, because there was no mechanism for identifying and correcting mistakes. A healer who consistently lost patients might be seen as unlucky or as having fallen out of favor with the gods, but their techniques would continue to be passed down to the next generation of practitioners. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire system was how Viking healers dealt with their inevitable failures. When patients died during or after treatment, which happened with shocking frequency, the healers didn't question their methods or consider that their techniques might be flawed. Instead, they developed an elaborate system of excuses and explanations that allowed them to maintain their reputation while avoiding any responsibility for the deaths they caused. If a patient died during surgery, the healer might claim that the gods had already decided the person's fate, and that the medical intervention was simply part of a divine plan. If someone succumbed to infection after a procedure, it might be attributed to the patient's lack of faith, or to curses cast by enemies, or to the influence of malevolent spirits that were too powerful to overcome through medical means. This created a horrifying feedback loop, where medical failures actually reinforced the healer's authority rather than undermining it. Every death became evidence of the supernatural forces that only the healers truly understood, and every survival became proof of their skill and divine favor. The worse their actual medical outcomes became, the more mystical and powerful they appeared to their communities. The psychological torture that patients endured was just as horrific as the physical procedures themselves. Imagine being told that your survival depends not just on enduring excruciating pain, but on maintaining the proper spiritual attitude throughout the ordeal. Patients were expected to demonstrate their faith and courage while undergoing procedures that would challenge the pain tolerance of even the most hardened warriors. Screaming or showing excessive signs of distress might be interpreted as evidence of spiritual weakness, which could supposedly compromise the effectiveness of the treatment. Patients were caught in an impossible situation where they had to suffer in relative silence while experiencing levels of agony that would break most people within minutes. The family members watching these procedures were subjected to their own form of psychological horror. They had to stand by helplessly while their loved ones underwent treatments that were clearly causing tremendous suffering, all while being told that any interference or expression of doubt could doom the patient's chances of recovery. Children grew up witnessing these medical horrors as normal parts of life, which meant that entire generations were traumatized by exposure to what amounted to ritualized torture disguised as healthcare. The psychological damage caused by repeatedly watching family members undergo these procedures must have been enormous, yet it was considered a necessary part of Viking culture. The gender dynamics of Viking medicine added another layer of horror to an already nightmarish system. While both men and women could serve as healers, the treatments they provided were often influenced by deeply problematic beliefs about gender and the human body. Women's medical issues were frequently attributed to hysteria, supernatural possession, or divine punishment for moral failings, which led to treatments that were both ineffective and deeply humiliating. Childbirth, which was already dangerous enough in medieval times, became even more perilous when Viking medical practices were involved. Healers might attempt to assist difficult births using techniques that increased the risk of infection, bleeding, and death for both mother and child. They had no understanding of basic obstetric principles, which meant that their interventions often turned manageable complications into fatal emergencies. The tools used for gynecological procedures were particularly crude and dangerous. We found archaeological evidence of instruments that appear to have been designed for internal examinations and procedures, but they were made from materials and designed in ways that would have caused tremendous trauma to delicate tissues. The idea of sterile technique was completely unknown, which meant that any internal procedure was essentially guaranteed to cause serious infection. Male patients faced their own unique horrors, particularly when it came to treating battle injuries. Viking culture placed enormous emphasis on warrior courage and stoicism, which meant that male patients were expected to endure even the most agonizing procedures without showing weakness. This cultural pressure often prevented men from accurately describing their symptoms or expressing the true extent of their pain, which led to misdiagnosis and inappropriate treatments. The treatment of genital injuries in male warriors was particularly barbaric. These injuries were relatively common in battle, but Viking healers had no understanding of the complex anatomy involved or the delicate techniques required for proper repair. Their attempts at treatment often resulted in permanent disfigurement, chronic pain, and psychological trauma that could last for the rest of the patient's life. The seasonal aspects of Viking medicine created additional nightmares for patients unlucky enough to require treatment during certain times of the year. During the long, dark winters, when communities were isolated and resources were scarce, medical care became even more primitive and dangerous than usual. Healers had limited access to whatever medicinal plants and materials they normally used, which meant that winter treatments were often improvised, using whatever was available. The cold weather also made surgical procedures more difficult and dangerous. Patients who were already weakened by injury or illness had to endure operations in freezing conditions without adequate heating or shelter. The risk of shock and hypothermia was enormous, and many patients probably died from exposure rather than from their original injuries. Summer brought its own medical horrors, particularly during the raiding season, when large numbers of wounded warriors would return to their communities all at once. Healers would be overwhelmed with patients, leading to rushed procedures and even less attention to proper technique than usual. The warm weather also increased the risk of infection and disease transmission, especially when multiple wounded patients were housed together in cramped, unsanitary conditions. The religious aspects of Viking medicine created some of the most disturbing scenarios imaginable. Healers often insisted that successful treatment required the patient to participate in elaborate religious rituals, some of which could be more dangerous than the original injury. Patients might be required to undergo purification ceremonies involving exposure to extreme heat or cold, consumption of toxic substances, or participation in violent ritual activities. Some treatments required the sacrifice of valuable animals or the destruction of precious possessions, which could leave families financially ruined even if the patient survived. The belief that the gods demanded these sacrifices as payment for healing meant that refusing to participate was seen as essentially condemning the patient to death, creating enormous pressure on families to comply with even the most extreme demands. The most chilling aspect of these religious medical practices was how they were used to justify failure and suffering. When treatments didn't work, which was most of the time, healers could always claim that the patient or their family hadn't demonstrated sufficient faith, or that they had somehow offended the gods during the healing process. This meant that medical failure was always the patient's fault, never the healer's, which eliminated any incentive for improvement or innovation. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Viking communities developed specialized facilities for medical treatment, but these places were more like chambers of horror than hospitals. We've found the remains of buildings that appear to have been dedicated to healing activities, and the artifacts discovered in these locations paint a terrifying picture of what went on inside them. These healing centers contained collections of surgical instruments that show evidence of heavy use, along with human remains that bear the marks of various medical procedures. Some of the bones show evidence of multiple operations performed on the same individual, suggesting that patients who survived their initial treatment were often subjected to additional procedures later on. The layout of these facilities suggests that they were designed to accommodate multiple patients simultaneously, which means that people undergoing surgery would have been forced to witness the suffering of other patients around them. The psychological impact of hearing the screams and seeing the blood of fellow patients while waiting for your own turn under the knife must have been absolutely devastating. But perhaps the most horrifying discovery in these archaeological sites is evidence that some procedures were performed on patients who were already dead. We've found human remains that show clear signs of post-mortem surgical intervention, suggesting that Viking healers sometimes practiced their techniques on corpses, either for training purposes or as part of religious rituals. This raises the disturbing possibility that living patients were sometimes subjected to experimental procedures that had only been tested on dead bodies, with no understanding of how the techniques might work on living tissue. The margin for error in such situations would have been enormous, and the suffering caused by these experimental surgeries defies imagination. The documentation of Viking medical practices, such as it was, reveals a system of record-keeping that was more concerned with spiritual and ritual aspects than with actual medical outcomes. Runic inscriptions and saga accounts that mention healing activities focus primarily on the supernatural elements of treatment, with very little attention paid to practical details like patient survival rates or the effectiveness of specific techniques. This means that Viking healers had no systematic way of evaluating their methods or learning from their mistakes. They couldn't compare the outcomes of different treatments or identify which techniques were more likely to succeed because they weren't tracking that kind of information. Their focus was on maintaining proper ritual protocols rather than achieving actual medical results. The lack of proper documentation also meant that dangerous techniques continued to be used long after they should have been abandoned. There was no mechanism for identifying treatments that consistently killed patients or for spreading information about rare successful outcomes that might have led to better practices. Even when Viking healers encountered foreign medical practices through trade and travel, they often misunderstood or misapplied these techniques in ways that made them even more dangerous than the original Viking methods. They might adopt the physical procedures without understanding the underlying principles, or they might combine foreign techniques with local ritual practices in ways that created entirely new forms of medical horror. The economic incentives built into the Viking medical system actually encouraged healers to perform more complex and dangerous procedures rather than simpler, safer treatments. Since payment was often based on the perceived difficulty and importance of the treatment rather than on actual results, healers had financial reasons to make their interventions as elaborate and dramatic as possible. This created a perverse situation where the most expensive treatments were often the most likely to kill the patient, but families felt compelled to pay for them anyway, because refusing elaborate treatment might be seen as not caring enough about their loved one's welfare. The economic pressure to undergo dangerous medical procedures must have caused tremendous suffering for Viking families, both financially and emotionally. The social hierarchy within Viking healing practices created additional layers of nightmare that went far beyond simple medical incompetence. High-ranking healers, those who served jarls and kings, developed increasingly elaborate and dangerous procedures specifically because their wealthy patients expected treatments that matched their social status. A common farmer might receive a basic herbal poultice for a wound, but a nobleman would demand surgical intervention that involved multiple healers, rare imported materials, and complex ritual preparations. These elite medical procedures were essentially death sentences disguised as premium healthcare. The more prestigious the healer and the more elaborate the treatment, the higher the chances that something would go catastrophically wrong. We're talking about operations that might involve opening multiple body cavities simultaneously, using experimental techniques that had never been tested, or combining treatments from different healing traditions in ways that created entirely new forms of medical disaster. The pressure to innovate and impress wealthy clients led some Viking healers to develop procedures that were so bizarre and dangerous that they defied all logic. Archaeological evidence suggests that some healers experimented with transplanting organs between patients, attempting to replace damaged tissue with healthy parts taken from other people. The fact that they had no understanding of tissue compatibility, immune responses, or surgical technique meant that these procedures were guaranteed to fail in the most horrific ways possible. But the true horror wasn't just in the procedures themselves. It was in how the Viking medical establishment responded when these experimental treatments inevitably went wrong. Rather than acknowledging that their techniques were flawed, healers would often double down on their methods, claiming that the failures were due to insufficient ritual preparation or inadequate spiritual purification of the patient. This led to a terrifying escalation, where subsequent patients would be subjected to even more extreme preparatory rituals before undergoing the same deadly procedures. We have evidence of patients being forced to undergo days of fasting, ritual scarification, and exposure to toxic substances before their actual surgery, all in the belief that these preparations would somehow make the impossible procedures more likely to succeed. The apprenticeship system that trained new Viking healers was a machinery of horror that guaranteed these deadly practices would continue indefinitely. Young apprentices would spend years observing procedures that killed more patients than they saved, but they would be told that these deaths were normal and expected parts of the healing process. They would learn to interpret patient screams as evidence that evil spirits were being driven out, and to see post-operative infections as signs that the body was purging itself of supernatural contamination. These apprentices would practice their techniques on patients who were already dying, using people in their final moments as training opportunities for procedures that would later be inflicted on healthier victims. The callousness required to treat human suffering as a learning exercise must have fundamentally warped the psychology of anyone who went through this training process. Even more disturbing was how experienced healers would sometimes deliberately sabotage their apprentices' early attempts at treatment, believing that failure and humiliation were necessary parts of the learning process. An apprentice might be given incorrect instructions or faulty tools, leading to even more patient deaths than would have occurred with proper guidance. This hazing process was justified as building character and testing the apprentice's commitment to the healing arts. The tools of Viking surgery deserve special attention because they represent some of the most nightmarish implements ever designed for use on the human body. While we've touched on their crude construction and lack of sterilization, the specific designs of these instruments reveal a level of medieval sadism that's hard to comprehend from a modern perspective. Take, for example, the bone extractors that have been found in healer burial sites. These were essentially oversized tweezers with serrated edges, designed to grip and remove bone fragments from wounds. The problem was that the serrations were so aggressive that they would tear through healthy tissue as well as damage bone, often causing more destruction than the original injury. Patients who survived the extraction process would be left with massive wounds that had virtually no chance of healing properly. The cauterization irons used by Viking healers were another source of unimaginable agony. These were metal rods that would be heated in fires until they glowed red hot, then pressed directly against bleeding wounds to supposedly stop hemorrhaging. The reality was that this technique often caused severe burns that extended far beyond the original injury site, creating infections that were worse than whatever bleeding they were meant to stop. But perhaps the most horrifying surgical tool was the skull drill used for trepanation procedures. These devices were designed to bore through bone slowly and deliberately, with the operator having to maintain steady pressure while rotating the drill by hand. The process could take hours, during which the patient would remain conscious and experience every moment of the drilling process. The psychological trauma of feeling and hearing your own skull being penetrated must have been as devastating as the physical pain. Archaeological analysis of these skull drills reveals that they were often used repeatedly without any cleaning or maintenance between patients. Some specimens show traces of organic material from multiple individuals, suggesting that the same contaminated drill was used on patient after patient, spreading infection and disease with each use. The seasonal variations in Viking medical practice created their own unique forms of horror that changed depending on the time of year. During spring thaws, when communities emerged from winter isolation, healers would often be confronted with patients who had been suffering from untreated conditions for months. The backlog of medical problems would lead to rushed, assembly line style treatments where patients received minimal attention and even less care than usual. Summer brought the raiding season, which meant that healers had to be prepared for mass casualty events when longships returned with holds full of wounded warriors. The sheer volume of patients meant that triage decisions had to be made, but these decisions were based on social status and political connections rather than medical need. A minor injury suffered by an important warrior might receive elaborate treatment, while a common raider with life-threatening wounds might be left to die. The autumn months were considered the optimal time for elective procedures, which led to a horrifying practice where non-urgent surgeries were deliberately delayed until this season. Patients with conditions that could have been treated immediately were forced to suffer for months while waiting for the supposedly auspicious timing, often dying from complications that could have been prevented with earlier intervention. Winter was perhaps the worst time to require medical care, not just because of the isolation and scarcity of supplies, but because of the psychological state of the healers themselves. The long, dark months took a toll on everyone's mental health, and healers were no exception. There's evidence that some practitioners became increasingly erratic and violent in their treatments during the winter months, possibly due to what we would now recognize as seasonal affective disorder or other psychological problems. The role of family members in Viking medical procedures created additional layers of trauma that extended far beyond the actual patients. Relatives were often required to participate directly in surgical procedures, holding down the patient or assisting with various aspects of the operation. This meant that family members had to become complicit in their loved one's suffering, creating psychological scars that could last for generations. Children were regularly exposed to these medical horrors as part of their education about adult responsibilities. Young Vikings would be brought to witness surgical procedures so they could learn what to expect if they were ever injured themselves. The psychological impact of watching a parent or sibling undergo medieval surgery must have been devastating, yet it was considered a necessary part of growing up in Viking society. The economic exploitation that surrounded Viking medicine reached levels that were almost as horrifying as the medical procedures themselves. Healers would often demand payment, not just for their services, but for the various ritual objects and sacrificial animals that were supposedly required for successful treatment. Families facing medical emergencies would be forced to sell their possessions, trade away their livestock, or even enter into debt bondage to pay for treatments that were more likely to kill their loved ones than save them. Some healers developed elaborate schemes to extract maximum payment from desperate families. They might insist that a patient's condition required multiple procedures spaced over weeks or months, each requiring separate payment and additional ritual preparations. By the time the patient finally died, which was almost inevitable, the family might be completely bankrupted and left with nothing but debt and grief. The most cynical healers would sometimes refuse to declare a patient dead until all possible treatments had been attempted and paid for. This meant that families would be forced to watch their loved ones suffer through procedure after procedure, each one more expensive and painful than the last, while the healer extracted every possible coin from the situation. The religious justifications for these economic practices were particularly cruel. Healers would claim that the gods demanded costly sacrifices as payment for their intervention, and that refusing to pay would not only doom the patient, but also bring divine wrath upon the entire family. This spiritual extortion ensured that even families who suspected the treatments were useless would feel compelled to pay whatever was demanded. The international aspects of Viking medicine created opportunities for even greater horrors as healers encountered foreign medical practices through trade and conquest. Rather than learning from more advanced medical traditions, Viking healers often misunderstood and corrupted foreign techniques, creating hybrid procedures that combined the worst aspects of multiple medical systems. For example, when Vikings encountered Byzantine or Islamic medical practices during their travels, they might observe complex surgical procedures without understanding the underlying anatomical knowledge or sterile techniques that made these operations possible. They would then return home and attempt to replicate what they had seen, but without the crucial knowledge that made the procedures safe and effective. This led to the development of pseudo-sophisticated surgical techniques that appeared advanced but were actually more dangerous than traditional Viking methods. Patients would be subjected to complex operations that their healers didn't truly understand, resulting in complications that were both unpredictable and untreatable. The language barriers that existed when Viking healers tried to learn from foreign practitioners created additional opportunities for deadly misunderstandings. Critical details about dosages, timing, and technique could be lost in translation, leading to treatments that bore only superficial resemblance to their foreign inspirations but retained all of their potential for causing harm. The documentation that survives from this period reveals that some Viking healers became obsessed with incorporating foreign elements into their practice, not because these elements were medically effective, but because they appeared exotic and impressive to potential patients. This led to a form of medical theatre where procedures became increasingly elaborate and ritualized, but no more effective and often significantly more dangerous. The psychological warfare aspects of Viking medicine were perhaps the most insidious element of this entire system. Healers understood that their authority depended on maintaining an aura of mystical power and specialized knowledge. so they deliberately cultivated fear and dependence among their patients and their families. This psychological manipulation began before any medical treatment was administered. Healers would often insist on elaborate consultation rituals, where they would examine the patient, consult various omens and signs, and deliver grave pronouncements about the spiritual forces responsible for the illness or injury. These consultations were designed to convince everyone present that the healer possessed supernatural insights that were essential for the patient's survival. The diagnostic process itself became a form of psychological torture, where patients were told that their suffering was the result of their own spiritual failings or the malevolent actions of their enemies. This created additional layers of guilt and fear that compounded the physical pain of their conditions and made them more psychologically vulnerable to whatever treatments the healer might prescribe. Once treatment began, healers would maintain psychological control by insisting that the patient's attitude and behavior during the procedure would determine its success or failure. Patients were told that showing too much pain or fear could anger the gods and doom the treatment, while demonstrating proper stoicism and faith could improve their chances of survival. This created an impossible psychological burden where patients had to suppress their natural responses to excruciating pain while maintaining an appearance of calm confidence. The aftermath of failed treatments, which was the usual outcome, involved additional psychological manipulation designed to protect the healer's reputation while transferring blame to the patient or their family. Healers developed elaborate explanations for why their treatments didn't work, always focusing on factors beyond their control, rather than acknowledging any flaws in their methods or techniques. These post-treatment explanations often involved accusations that the patient had hidden some crucial information, failed to follow instructions properly, or been the victim of curses that were too powerful for medical intervention to overcome. Family members might be told that their lack of faith or improper behavior during the healing process had contributed to the patient's death, creating lasting guilt and trauma that could affect entire families for generations. The training rituals that Viking healers used to initiate new practitioners into their profession represented some of the most disturbing aspects of this entire medical system. These initiation ceremonies often involved deliberately traumatic experiences designed to break down the apprentice's normal human empathy and replace it with the callous detachment that was considered necessary for effective healing work. New apprentices might be required to participate in mock surgical procedures performed on animals or corpses, learning to cut and manipulate flesh without emotional response. They would be taught to interpret screams and signs of distress as normal parts of the healing process rather than indications that something was wrong with their techniques. Some initiation rituals involved the apprentice undergoing painful procedures themselves, supposedly to give them first-hand experience of what their future patients would endure. These ritual scarifications, burns, or other injuries were justified as necessary for developing proper empathy, but they actually served to normalize violence and suffering as acceptable parts of medical practice. The most disturbing initiation practices involved requiring apprentices to participate in the deaths of patients, either through deliberate overdoses of toxic substances or through procedures that were known to be fatal. These ritual killings were presented as mercy killings or as necessary sacrifices to the gods, but they served to desensitize new healers to patient death and to implicate them in the system of medical violence that they would be expected to perpetuate throughout their careers. By the time an apprentice completed their training and became a full healer, they had been systematically stripped of normal human compassion and transformed into practitioners who could inflict tremendous suffering while believing they were providing beneficial care. This psychological transformation was perhaps the most horrifying aspect of the entire Viking medical system, because it created individuals who were capable of perpetrating medical atrocities while maintaining complete confidence in their methods and moral righteousness in their actions. The legacy of Viking medical practices extended far beyond the immediate suffering they caused to individual patients. These techniques and attitudes influenced medical practice throughout medieval Europe, spreading dangerous misconceptions and brutal procedures that would continue to kill patients for centuries after the Viking Age had ended. The spread of Viking medical practices throughout medieval Europe created a network of horror that extended far beyond Scandinavia itself. As Viking traders, raiders, and settlers established communities across the continent, they brought their nightmarish healing traditions with them, infecting local medical practices with their dangerous misconceptions and brutal techniques. What makes this cultural contamination even more disturbing is how readily other medieval societies adopted Viking medical practices, often because they appeared more dramatic and authoritative than their own traditional healing methods. Local healers in England, Ireland, and France would observe Viking surgical procedures and assume that the elaborate rituals and confident brutality indicated superior medical knowledge. This cultural exchange created hybrid medical systems that combined the worst aspects of multiple traditions. English healers might incorporate Viking trepanation techniques into their own practice, while adding their own dangerous innovations, like the use of heated metals to cauterize brain tissue. French practitioners would adopt Viking amputation methods, but modify them using their own crude understanding of anatomy, creating procedures that were even more likely to result in death than the original Viking versions. The most horrifying aspect of this medical cross-contamination was how it accelerated the development of increasingly dangerous procedures. When healers from different cultures compared techniques, they didn't focus on which methods produced better patient outcomes. Instead, they competed to develop the most impressive and elaborate procedures, leading to an arms race of medical brutality that pushed the boundaries of human suffering ever further. Archaeological evidence from across medieval Europe shows clear signs of this Viking medical influence. Surgical tools found in non-Scandinavian burial sites begin to show Viking design characteristics during the periods of heaviest cultural contact. More disturbingly, human remains from this era show evidence of surgical procedures that combine Viking techniques with local innovations, creating entirely new forms of medical mutilation. The economic model of Viking medicine also spread throughout Europe, transforming healing from a community service into a profit-driven enterprise that prioritized payment over patient welfare. Local healers learned to demand elaborate compensation for their services and to extend treatments over longer periods to maximize their earnings from each patient. This commercialization of medicine created perverse incentives that made medical care even more dangerous than it had been under traditional systems. Healers who had once provided simple, relatively safe treatments to their communities now felt pressure to offer more complex and expensive procedures to compete with the Viking practitioners who were establishing themselves in their territories. The religious aspects of Viking medicine proved particularly infectious, spreading throughout Christian Europe despite official church opposition to pagan healing practices. Local healers would adopt Viking ritual elements while claiming they were invoking Christian saints rather than Norse gods, creating syncretic medical practices that combined spiritual manipulation with physical brutality. These hybrid religious medical practices were often more dangerous than either pure Viking or pure Christian healing methods, because they involved longer and more complex ritual preparations that delayed actual treatment while increasing the opportunities for things to go wrong. Patients might spend days undergoing purification ceremonies and religious observances before finally receiving medical attention, by which time their conditions had often progressed beyond any hope of recovery. The psychological techniques that Viking healers used to maintain authority and control over their patients also spread throughout medieval Europe, transforming the relationship between healers and patients across the continent. The idea that patients needed to demonstrate proper spiritual attitude during treatment became widespread, creating additional layers of psychological torture for people who were already suffering from serious injuries or illnesses. European healers learned to use guilt and fear as medical tools, convincing patients that their recovery depended not just on physical treatment, but on their moral worthiness and spiritual purity. This created a system where medical failure could always be blamed on the patient's inadequate faith or hidden sins, protecting healers from criticism while adding psychological torment to physical suffering. The training methods used by Viking healers also influenced medical education throughout Europe, spreading techniques that systematically destroyed normal human empathy and replaced it with callous indifference to patient suffering. Apprentice healers across the continent began to undergo initiation rituals that involved deliberate exposure to violence and death, supposedly to prepare them for the realities of medical practice. These training practices created generations of European healers who had been psychologically conditioned to view patient suffering as normal and necessary, and who lacked the emotional capacity to question whether their treatments were actually helping or harming the people they claimed to serve. The systematic destruction of medical empathy became a standard part of healer training across medieval Europe, ensuring that dangerous and brutal practices would continue indefinitely. The documentation practices of Viking medicine also spread throughout Europe, creating a continent-wide system of medical record-keeping that focused on ritual compliance rather than patient outcomes. Healers across Europe began to maintain records that emphasized the spiritual and ceremonial aspects of their treatments, while ignoring practical details like survival rates and treatment effectiveness. This shift in documentation priorities meant that dangerous medical practices could spread and persist without any systematic evaluation of their actual results. Healers could share techniques and procedures without any meaningful discussion of whether these methods actually helped patients, leading to the rapid dissemination of treatments that were not just ineffective, but actively harmful. The seasonal patterns of Viking medical practice also influenced healing traditions throughout Europe, creating continent-wide cycles of medical activity that were based on superstition rather than medical need. European healers adopted the Viking practice of timing surgical procedures according to religious calendars and astronomical events, often delaying urgent treatments for weeks or months while waiting for supposedly auspicious conditions. This ritualization of medical timing created additional opportunities for patients to die from treatable conditions while waiting for their healers to determine that the spiritual conditions were right for intervention. The Viking influence transformed European medicine from a responsive system that addressed medical emergencies as they arose into a rigid ceremonial practice that prioritized religious observance over patient welfare. The gender dynamics of Viking medicine also spread throughout medieval Europe, introducing new forms of discrimination and abuse into medical practice. European healers adopted Viking beliefs about the spiritual causes of women's medical problems, leading to treatments that were both medically useless and deeply humiliating. The Viking approach to childbirth and gynecological issues became widespread across Europe, introducing dangerous interventions and crude surgical techniques that increased mortality rates for women throughout the continent. European midwives and healers began to adopt Viking tools and procedures that were designed without any understanding of female anatomy, leading to complications and deaths that could have been prevented with traditional care. The military medical practices of the Vikings also influenced European approaches to battlefield medicine, spreading techniques that were supposedly designed to get wounded warriors back into combat as quickly as possible. These rapid treatment methods prioritized immediate functionality over long-term health, often leaving soldiers with permanent disabilities and chronic pain that would plague them for the rest of their lives. European armies began to adopt Viking field surgery techniques that involved crude amputations, hasty wound closures, and dangerous stimulants that could temporarily mask the symptoms of serious injuries. These military medical practices created generations of disabled veterans throughout Europe, while also spreading dangerous surgical techniques that would eventually be applied to civilian patients. The social hierarchy that governed Viking medical practice also influenced European healthcare systems, creating formal structures that determined who received what level of medical care based on their social status rather than their medical needs. European societies began to develop tiered medical systems where the wealthy received elaborate and dangerous treatments, while the poor were left with basic care that was often more effective, simply because it involved fewer opportunities for medical error. This stratification of medical care created additional forms of inequality and suffering throughout medieval Europe, while also accelerating the development of increasingly dangerous procedures for wealthy patients who expected treatments that matched their social status. The Viking model of premium medical care became the standard for European nobility, guaranteeing that the most powerful members of society would receive the most dangerous and ineffective treatments available. The trade networks that connected Viking communities also served as conduits for spreading dangerous medical practices throughout the known world. Viking merchants and raiders would encounter foreign medical techniques during their travels, but they would typically misunderstand these procedures and bring back corrupted versions that were more dangerous than either the original foreign methods or traditional Viking practices. These medical trade networks created a global system for spreading dangerous healing practices, with Viking traders serving as vectors for medical misinformation that would influence healing traditions from Ireland to Constantinople. The Viking appetite for exotic medical knowledge led to the development of increasingly bizarre hybrid procedures that combined elements from multiple medical traditions without understanding how these elements were supposed to work together. The archaeological record shows clear evidence of this medical globalization, with burial sites across Europe and beyond containing surgical tools and human remains that show signs of procedures influenced by multiple medical traditions. These hybrid medical practices often produced results that were worse than any single medical system would have achieved on its own, creating new forms of suffering that were unprecedented in human history. The preservation techniques used by Viking healers to maintain their surgical instruments and medical supplies also spread throughout Europe, introducing new methods of tool maintenance that actually increase the risk of infection and disease transmission. European healers adopted Viking practices of storing surgical instruments in organic materials that provided ideal breeding grounds for bacteria, while also learning Viking techniques for sharpening and modifying tools that often made them more dangerous to use. These seemingly minor technical details had enormous impacts on patient outcomes throughout medieval Europe, as healers across the continent began to use contaminated and improperly maintained surgical instruments that virtually guaranteed that any invasive procedure would result in serious infection. The Viking influence on European medical technology created a continent-wide infrastructure of contaminated surgical tools that would continue to kill patients for centuries. The memorial practices associated with Viking medicine also influenced European approaches to documenting and commemorating medical procedures, creating new forms of medical record-keeping that celebrated the drama and complexity of treatments rather than their effectiveness. European healers began to create elaborate monuments and inscriptions that commemorated particularly impressive surgical procedures, regardless of whether these procedures had actually saved the patient's life. These medical memorials served to perpetuate dangerous practices by creating permanent records that emphasized the heroic aspects of medical intervention while ignoring the human cost of these procedures. Future healers would study these monuments and inscriptions as guides for their own practice, learning to replicate procedures that had been commemorated for their dramatic impact rather than their medical success. The dietary and pharmaceutical practices associated with Viking medicine also spread throughout Europe, introducing new forms of medical poisoning that were disguised as therapeutic treatments. European healers adopted Viking practices of using toxic plants and minerals as medicines, often without understanding the proper dosages or contraindications that might make these substances less immediately fatal. These pharmaceutical innovations created new categories of medical disaster throughout medieval Europe, as healers experimented with imported drugs and treatments that had been developed for different populations with different genetic characteristics and cultural practices. The Viking influence on European pharmacy created a continent-wide epidemic of iatrogenic poisoning that would continue to kill patients long after the Viking Age had ended. The architectural influences of Viking medicine can still be seen in the design of medieval European hospitals and healing centers, which adopted Viking practices of housing multiple patients in shared spaces where they could witness each other's suffering. These architectural decisions, which were supposedly made for practical reasons, actually created environments that maximized psychological trauma while also facilitating the spread of disease and infection. European hospital design began to incorporate Viking principles of medical theatre, creating spaces where surgical procedures could be performed in front of audiences of other patients and family members. These design decisions transformed medical treatment into public spectacles that prioritized dramatic impact over patient welfare, while also creating opportunities for cross-contamination that would kill patients who had come to the hospital with relatively minor conditions. The legal frameworks that governed Viking medical practice also influenced European approaches to medical regulation, creating systems that protected healers from liability while providing no meaningful protection for patients. European legal systems adopted Viking principles that made it virtually impossible to hold healers accountable for patient deaths, while also creating new forms of legal obligation that required families to pay for medical treatments regardless of their outcomes. These legal innovations created continent-wide systems of medical impunity that allowed dangerous practitioners to continue their work without fear of consequences, while also creating financial incentives that encouraged healers to attempt increasingly risky and expensive procedures. The Viking influence on European medical law created legal frameworks that prioritized the economic interests of healers over the welfare of patients, ensuring that dangerous medical practices would continue to flourish under legal protection. The artistic and cultural representations of Viking medical practices also influenced European attitudes toward medicine and healing, creating cultural narratives that romanticized medical suffering and portrayed dangerous procedures as heroic interventions. European art and literature began to celebrate the dramatic aspects of medical treatment, while ignoring the human cost of these procedures, creating cultural contexts that made it difficult to criticize or reform dangerous medical practices. These cultural representations served to normalize medical violence throughout medieval Europe, creating societies where extreme suffering during medical treatment was seen as evidence of the healer's skill and the patient's courage, rather than as signs that something was fundamentally wrong with the medical system. The Viking influence on European medical culture created lasting changes in how societies understood the relationship between healing and suffering, changes that would influence medical practice for centuries to come. The environmental impacts of Viking medical practices also spread throughout Europe, as healers across the continent adopted Viking methods of disposing of medical waste and contaminated materials. These disposal practices often involved dumping infected tissues and contaminated instruments in water sources or burying them in shallow graves near populated areas, creating environmental hazards that would continue to spread disease long after the original medical procedures had been completed. European communities began to experience new patterns of epidemic disease that were directly linked to the environmental contamination caused by Viking-influenced medical practices. The Viking approach to medical waste management created lasting environmental health problems throughout medieval Europe, contributing to cycles of epidemic disease that would continue to kill people for generations after the original medical procedures had been forgotten. The technological innovations that emerged from Viking medical practice also influenced European approaches to surgical instrument design and manufacturing, leading to the development of new categories of medical tools that were more dangerous than their predecessors. European metalworkers began to produce surgical instruments based on Viking designs, often without understanding the specific techniques required to use these tools safely. These technological transfers created new opportunities for medical disaster throughout medieval Europe, as healers gained access to more sophisticated surgical instruments without acquiring the knowledge needed to use them effectively. The Viking influence on European medical technology created a continent-wide proliferation of dangerous surgical tools that would continue to cause patient deaths long after their original designers had been forgotten. The economic systems that supported Viking medical practice also influenced European approaches to healthcare financing, creating new models of medical commerce that prioritize profit over patient welfare. European communities began to adopt Viking practices of treating medical care as a luxury commodity rather than a community service, leading to the development of market-based healthcare systems that excluded the poor while providing dangerous and expensive treatments to the wealthy. These economic innovations transformed European healthcare from community-based systems of mutual support into commercial enterprises that served the interests of healers rather than patients. The Viking influence on European medical economics created lasting changes in how societies organized and funded healthcare, changes that would continue to influence medical practice long after the Viking Age had ended. The psychological conditioning that Viking healers underwent to prepare them for their gruesome work represents one of the most disturbing aspects of their entire medical system. These practitioners didn't simply stumble into brutality through ignorance. They were systematically trained to suppress their natural human responses to suffering and to view patient agony as a necessary and even beneficial part of the healing process. The transformation of a normal person into a Viking healer began in childhood, often when future practitioners were as young as 8 or 9 years old. These children would be selected based on supposed spiritual gifts or family connections to existing healers, and their education would begin with exposure to increasingly disturbing medical scenarios designed to desensitize them to human suffering. Young apprentices would first be required to observe animal sacrifices and butchering procedures, learning to watch without flinching as living creatures were systematically dismembered. They would be taught that the screams and struggles of these animals were meaningless, that the spiritual benefits of the ritual far outweighed any temporary discomfort the creatures might experience. Once they had demonstrated sufficient callousness toward animal suffering, the apprentices would be allowed to observe human medical procedures. They would watch as patients underwent trepanation, amputation, and organ manipulation, and they would be punished severely if they showed any signs of sympathy or distress at what they witnessed. The training process included deliberate exercises designed to break down normal emotional responses to pain and death. Apprentices might be required to practice surgical techniques on recently deceased corpses, learning to cut and manipulate human flesh until they could do so with the same detachment they might show when carving wood or working leather. Some training programs included ritualized torture sessions, where apprentices would be required to inflict pain on animals or even on each other, supposedly to develop the steady hands and unwavering focus that were considered essential for surgical work. These exercises were justified as necessary preparation for the difficult decisions that healers would face in their practice, but they actually served to create practitioners who were psychologically incapable of empathy. The most advanced apprentices would be required to participate directly in patient deaths, either by administering fatal doses of toxic substances or by performing procedures that were known to be lethal. These ritual killings were presented as mercy killings or as offerings to the gods, but they served to implicate the apprentices in the system of medical violence and to eliminate any remaining traces of normal human compassion. By the time an apprentice completed this training and became a full healer, they had been transformed into something that was barely recognizable as human. They could watch a patient die in agony from their ministrations and feel nothing but professional satisfaction at having performed the ritual correctly. They could amputate healthy limbs or drill holes in functioning skulls without experiencing any emotional response to the suffering they were causing. The social reinforcement systems that supported these psychologically damaged healers ensured that their callousness would be celebrated rather than questioned. Viking communities praised healers who could perform the most difficult and painful procedures without hesitation, viewing their emotional detachment as evidence of spiritual strength and professional competence. This created a horrifying feedback loop where the most psychologically damaged healers received the most respect and the highest fees, while practitioners who retained any trace of normal human empathy were viewed as weak and ineffective. the entire social structure of Viking medicine was designed to reward psychopathy and to punish any remaining traces of human compassion. The religious frameworks that justified Viking medical practices were carefully constructed to make questioning or criticism virtually impossible. Healers claimed direct communication with the gods, and they presented their medical decisions as divine commands that could not be challenged without risking supernatural punishment. This religious authority was used to silence anyone who might question why so many patients died during treatment, or why the treatments themselves seemed to cause more suffering than the original injuries. Family members who expressed doubts about a healer's methods would be accused of lacking faith or of interfering with divine will, while patients who survived would be told that their recovery was proof of the healer's spiritual power. The most insidious aspect of this religious manipulation was how it was used to justify increasingly extreme procedures. If a simple treatment failed, healers would claim that the gods demanded more elaborate rituals and more intensive intervention. This created an escalating cycle where each failure was used to justify even more dangerous procedures, with the patient's suffering being interpreted as evidence that the spirits required greater sacrifice. The economic exploitation that surrounded these religious medical practices was breathtaking in its cynicism. Healers would demand payment not just for their services, but for the various ritual objects, sacrificial animals, and ceremonial preparations that were supposedly required for successful treatment. Families facing medical emergencies would be told that their loved one's life depended on their willingness to pay whatever was demanded, regardless of their ability to afford it. The most unscrupulous healers developed elaborate schemes to extract maximum payment from desperate families. They might claim that a patient's condition required rare and expensive imported materials, or that the gods demanded specific types of sacrificial animals that could only be obtained at great cost. By the time the patient died, which was almost inevitable, the family would often be completely bankrupted. The documentation systems used by Viking healers were designed to obscure rather than illuminate the true nature of their practices. Rather than keeping records of patient outcomes or treatment effectiveness, healers maintained elaborate accounts of ritual compliance and spiritual significance that made it virtually impossible to evaluate their actual medical performance. These records focused obsessively on details like the proper arrangement of ceremonial objects, the correct pronunciation of ritual incantations, and the appropriate timing of various procedures according to astronomical events. Meanwhile, crucial information like patient survival rates, complication frequencies, and treatment outcomes was either ignored completely or buried beneath layers of mystical interpretation. This documentation system served to protect healers from criticism by making it impossible to demonstrate that their treatments were ineffective or harmful. Any attempt to evaluate medical outcomes could be dismissed as focusing on mundane physical concerns while ignoring the more important spiritual dimensions of healing. The training materials that were passed down from master healers to their apprentices were masterpieces of misdirection that taught complex ritual procedures while providing virtually no useful medical knowledge. These texts were filled with elaborate descriptions of ceremonial preparations and spiritual considerations, but they contained almost no practical information about human anatomy, disease processes, or effective treatments. Apprentice healers would spend years memorizing these ritualistic procedures, learning to perform complex ceremonies with perfect precision while remaining completely ignorant of basic medical principles. They would graduate from their training programs with detailed knowledge of how to conduct elaborate healing rituals, but with no understanding of whether these rituals actually helped patients or simply provided theatrical entertainment while people died. The competitive dynamics between different Viking healers created additional pressures that pushed medical practice toward ever greater levels of brutality and spectacle. Healers would compete with each other to develop the most impressive and elaborate procedures, not because these procedures were more effective, but because they attracted more attention and commanded higher fees. This professional rivalry led to an arms race of medical horror where healers constantly tried to outdo each other with increasingly complex and dangerous innovations. A healer who performed simple trepanation might find themselves overshadowed by a competitor who claimed to be able to transplant organs or perform multiple simultaneous surgeries, regardless of whether these advanced procedures actually produced better outcomes. The pressure to innovate and impress led some healers to experiment with procedures that were so bizarre and dangerous that they defied all logic. Archaeological evidence suggests that some practitioners attempted to perform brain surgery using heated metals, to transplant limbs between different patients, or to treat internal injuries by deliberately introducing infections that were supposed to fight the original disease. These experimental procedures were often presented as ancient techniques that had been revealed through divine inspiration or supernatural communication, lending them an authority that made it difficult for anyone to question their legitimacy. Patients and families would be told that they were receiving treatments that were so advanced and sacred that only the most skilled and spiritually gifted healers were capable of performing them. The seasonal cycles that governed Viking medical practice created additional opportunities for exploitation and abuse as healers learned to manipulate the timing of treatments to maximize their profits and minimize their accountability. Certain procedures would be declared appropriate only during specific times of the year, forcing patients to wait months for treatment while their conditions worsened. During these waiting periods, healers would often prescribe expensive preparatory treatments that were supposedly necessary to prepare the patient's body and spirit for the eventual surgery. These preliminary procedures might include dietary restrictions that left patients weakened and malnourished, ritual scarifications that created additional wounds and infection risks, or the consumption of toxic substances that were claimed to have purifying effects. By the time the patient was finally deemed ready for the main procedure, they were often in worse condition than when they had first sought treatment. The months of preparatory abuse would have weakened their immune systems and reduced their chances of surviving whatever surgery was eventually performed. But the healers would blame any negative outcomes on the patient's failure to properly prepare themselves spiritually. The international networks that connected Viking healers with practitioners from other cultures created opportunities for the development of hybrid procedures that were more dangerous than any single medical tradition. When Viking healers encountered foreign medical techniques, they would often misunderstand the underlying principles, while focusing obsessively on the most dramatic and impressive aspects of what they observed. This led to the creation of fusion procedures that combined Viking brutality with foreign complexity, producing treatments that were guaranteed to fail in spectacular and painful ways. A Viking healer might observe a Byzantine surgeon performing a delicate eye operation and decide to replicate the procedure using Viking tools and techniques, creating a hybrid surgery that retained all the risks of both medical traditions while providing none of the benefits of either. These international medical exchanges also created opportunities for cultural one-upmanship, where healers would claim to have learned secret techniques from distant lands, regardless of whether they actually understood these procedures or had any training in performing them safely. Patients would pay premium prices for exotic treatments that were supposedly based on advanced foreign knowledge, but which were actually crude improvisations that were more likely to kill than cure. The preservation and transmission of medical knowledge in Viking society was hampered by the same ritualistic thinking that plagued their actual medical practice. Rather than focusing on practical information that might improve patient outcomes, Viking medical texts and oral traditions emphasized mystical aspects of healing that had little connection to effective treatment. This meant that each generation of healers inherited not accumulated medical wisdom, but an increasingly elaborate collection of superstitions and dangerous practices that had been passed down without any critical evaluation. Techniques that consistently killed patients were preserved and transmitted with the same reverence as procedures that occasionally produced positive results, because the focus was on maintaining traditional practices rather than improving medical outcomes. The result was a medical system that actually became more dangerous over time, as each generation of healers added their own innovations and interpretations to an already deadly collection of procedures. Rather than learning from the failures of their predecessors, Viking healers treated past disasters as learning experiences that required them to perform the same procedures with even greater ritual precision. The gender dynamics within Viking medical practice created additional layers of horror that affected both male and female patients in different but equally devastating ways. Female healers often specialized in women's medical issues, but their understanding of female anatomy was so distorted by cultural beliefs and superstitions that their treatments were frequently more harmful than helpful. Women seeking medical care for reproductive issues would often be subjected to procedures that were based on the belief that female organs were fundamentally different from and inferior to male anatomy. This led to treatments that involved deliberate trauma to reproductive organs, the insertion of foreign objects into body cavities, and the use of caustic substances that were supposed to purify or strengthen female tissues. Male patients faced their own unique horrors, particularly when seeking treatment for injuries to their reproductive organs. Viking culture's emphasis on masculine strength and sexual prowess meant that any injury to male genitalia was considered not just a physical problem, but a spiritual crisis that required elaborate and often mutilating treatments designed to restore the patient's masculine essence. The tools used for these gender-specific procedures were among the most horrifying implements in the Viking medical arsenal. Archaeological evidence reveals specialized instruments designed for internal examinations and manipulations that would have caused tremendous trauma and virtually guaranteed serious infections. These tools were often used repeatedly on multiple patients without any cleaning or sterilization, spreading disease and contamination throughout entire communities. The training of healers who specialized in gender-specific medicine involved additional forms of psychological conditioning that were designed to overcome normal human reluctance to inflict intimate violence on vulnerable patients. These specialists underwent extended apprenticeships that included practice on animals, corpses, and eventually living patients, learning to perform procedures that required them to ignore both their own human instincts and their patients' obvious suffering. The social pressures surrounding gender-specific medical treatment created situations where patients felt compelled to undergo dangerous procedures rather than face the shame of being seen as unwilling to endure necessary treatment. Women might submit to mutilating gynecological procedures because refusing treatment would be interpreted as evidence of moral weakness or spiritual corruption, while men would agree to genital surgery rather than risk being seen as cowardly or unmanly. The religious justifications for these gender-specific treatments were particularly cruel, as they were often presented as necessary for maintaining proper relationships with gender-specific deities or for fulfilling cultural expectations about masculine and feminine roles. Patients would be told that their medical problems were evidence that they had failed to properly embody their gender roles, and that the treatments were necessary not just for physical healing, but for spiritual redemption. The economic aspects of gender-specific medicine created additional opportunities for exploitation, as healers could charge premium prices for treatments that were supposedly tailored to the unique spiritual and physical needs of male or female patients. These specialized procedures were often more expensive than general medical treatments, but they were also more likely to result in complications and death because they involved intimate manipulations of delicate and vulnerable body parts. The long-term consequences of surviving Viking medical treatment were often worse than death itself, as patients who lived through the initial procedures frequently suffered from chronic pain, permanent disabilities, and ongoing infections that would plague them for the rest of their lives. The crude surgical techniques and contaminated instruments used by Viking healers virtually guaranteed that any invasive procedure would result in lasting damage, even if the patient survived the immediate trauma. Survivors of trepanation procedures often experienced chronic headaches, seizures, and cognitive impairments that made it difficult for them to function normally in their communities. The holes drilled in their skulls provided permanent entry points for infections, and many patients would suffer from recurring episodes of illness that were directly related to their surgical treatment. Amputation survivors faced even worse prospects, as the crude cutting and cauterization techniques used by Viking healers left them with stumps that were prone to infection and chronic pain. The lack of proper wound care meant that these surgical sites rarely healed completely, leaving patients with open wounds that would weep and fester for months or years after their operations. The psychological trauma experienced by medical survivors was perhaps even more devastating than their physical injuries. Patients who had endured hours of excruciating pain during conscious surgery often developed what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing nightmares, panic attacks, and an inability to function normally in social situations. These psychological wounds were compounded by the social stigma that often attached to medical survivors, as their visible scars and disabilities served as permanent reminders of their encounters with the healing arts. Rather than being celebrated for their survival, these patients were often viewed as examples of divine displeasure or spiritual weakness, adding social isolation to their physical and psychological suffering. The families of medical patients, whether they survived or died, were also traumatized by their exposure to Viking medical practices. Parents who had watched their children undergo brutal surgical procedures carried emotional scars that affected their relationships with their surviving family members, while spouses and siblings struggled to cope with the memories of witnessing medical violence inflicted on their loved ones. The cumulative effect of these individual traumas was the creation of entire communities that were psychologically damaged by their exposure to medical horror. Viking society became increasingly accepting of violence and suffering as normal parts of life, partly because so many people had been conditioned to view extreme pain as an acceptable price for supposed medical benefits. This cultural normalization of medical violence had lasting effects that extended far beyond the immediate victims of surgical procedures. Children who grew up witnessing these medical horrors developed distorted understandings of human value and acceptable behavior, while adults who participated in or observed medical procedures became increasingly callous toward human suffering in general. The archaeological evidence for the long-term consequences of Viking medical practice is both extensive and disturbing. Burial sites throughout Scandinavia contain the remains of individuals who clearly survived surgical procedures, but lived with the consequences for years or decades afterward. These skeletal remains show evidence of chronic infections, malformed healing, and progressive deterioration that can be directly linked to medical interventions. Some of the most disturbing archaeological finds are the remains of individuals who underwent multiple surgical procedures over the course of their lives, suggesting that surviving one medical intervention often led to additional procedures that were supposed to address the complications caused by the original surgery. These patients became trapped in cycles of medical violence that continued until they finally succumbed to the cumulative damage inflicted by their healers. The tools and instruments found in these burial sites tell their own horrifying stories, with many surgical implements showing evidence of repeated use and inadequate maintenance that would have made them increasingly dangerous over time. Some instruments show signs of modification and repair that suggest they were used far beyond their safe operational life, while others appear to have been deliberately altered in ways that would have made them more likely to cause tissue damage. The distribution patterns of these archaeological finds suggest that Viking medical practices were not limited to major population centers or wealthy communities, but were widespread throughout Scandinavian society. Even small rural settlements show evidence of surgical activity, indicating that the horrors of Viking medicine affected people at every level of society and in every corner of the Viking world. The preservation of organic materials in some archaeological sites has provided even more disturbing evidence of Viking medical practices, including textiles that appear to have been used for medical procedures and show staining patterns consistent with repeated exposure to blood and other bodily fluids. These materials suggest that Viking medical procedures were often performed in unsanitary conditions that would have maximized the risk of infection and cross-contamination. The international spread of Viking medical practices through trade and conquest created a legacy of medical horror that extended far beyond Scandinavia itself. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements in Ireland, England, France, and other regions shows clear signs of surgical activity that follows Viking patterns and techniques, indicating that these dangerous practices were exported along with other aspects of Viking culture. The most disturbing aspect of this archaeological evidence is how it demonstrates the persistence and continuity of these medical practices over time. Rather than improving or evolving in response to their obvious failures, Viking medical techniques remained remarkably consistent across centuries and geographic regions, suggesting that the practitioners were either unable or unwilling to learn from their repeated disasters. The human cost of Viking medical practice, as revealed through archaeological and historical evidence, represents one of the most systematic and prolonged episodes of medical violence in human history. The combination of ignorance, superstition, economic exploitation, and psychological manipulation created a perfect storm of suffering that affected countless thousands of people across centuries of time and vast geographic regions. What makes this medical disaster even more tragic is how preventable much of the suffering was. Many of the conditions that Viking healers attempted to treat would have resolved on their own, with simple rest and basic wound care, while others could have been effectively managed using herbal remedies and other traditional treatments that were already known to Viking society. Instead, patients who might have recovered completely with minimal intervention were subjected to procedures that virtually guaranteed their death or permanent disability. The Viking medical system transformed treatable injuries and illnesses into fatal catastrophes, creating suffering where none was necessary and death where life was possible. The legacy of Viking medicine serves as a powerful reminder of how medical systems can become corrupted by non-medical considerations like profit, power, and superstition. When healing becomes subordinated to other agendas, the result is inevitably the creation of systems that harm rather than help, that exploit rather than serve, and that create suffering rather than alleviate it. The lessons of Viking medical practice remain relevant today as they demonstrate how easily medical systems can be corrupted when they lose sight of their fundamental purpose: the relief of human suffering and the preservation of human life. The Vikings created a medical system that served every purpose except the one that mattered most, and the result was centuries of unnecessary agony inflicted on people who deserved compassion and care rather than exploitation and abuse. The psychological conditioning required to become a Viking healer involved a systematic destruction of normal human empathy that began in early childhood and continued throughout their entire training process. Young apprentices were deliberately exposed to increasingly disturbing scenarios designed to strip away their natural responses to suffering and replace them with cold, clinical detachment. These future healers would start their education by observing the slaughter of animals, learning to watch without flinching as living creatures were systematically dismembered for food or sacrifice. They were taught that the cries and struggles of these animals were meaningless noise that interfered with the important work at hand, and they would be punished severely if they showed any signs of distress or sympathy. Once they had demonstrated sufficient callousness toward animal suffering, the apprentices would be allowed to observe human medical procedures. They would watch as conscious patients underwent trepanation, amputation, and organ manipulation, and they were expected to maintain complete emotional neutrality throughout these horrifying spectacles. Any display of sympathy or revulsion would result in immediate dismissal from the training program. The most advanced stages of healer training involve direct participation in patient deaths. Apprentices would be required to administer fatal doses of toxic substances, or to perform procedures that were known to be lethal, supposedly as acts of mercy or religious sacrifice. These ritual killings served to implicate the trainees in the system of medical violence while eliminating any remaining traces of normal human compassion. By the time an apprentice completed this psychological conditioning and became a full healer, they had been transformed into something that was barely recognizable as human. They could watch a patient die in agony from their ministrations and feel nothing but professional satisfaction at having performed the ritual correctly. They could drill holes in functioning skulls or amputate healthy limbs without experiencing any emotional response to the suffering they were causing. The social structures that supported these psychologically damaged healers ensured that their callousness would be celebrated rather than questioned. Viking communities praised healers who could perform the most difficult and painful procedures without hesitation, viewing their emotional detachment as evidence of spiritual strength and professional competence. This created a horrifying feedback loop where the most psychologically damaged practitioners received the highest respect and the largest fees. The religious frameworks that justified these medical practices were carefully constructed to make criticism virtually impossible. Healers claimed direct communication with the gods, presenting their medical decisions as divine commands that could not be challenged without risking supernatural punishment. This religious authority was used to silence anyone who might question why so many patients died during treatment, or why the treatments themselves seemed to cause more suffering than the original injuries. The most insidious aspect of this religious manipulation was how it was used to justify increasingly extreme procedures. When simple treatments failed, healers would claim that the gods demanded more elaborate rituals and more intensive intervention. This created an escalating cycle where each failure was used to justify even more dangerous procedures, with the patient's suffering being interpreted as evidence that the spirits required greater sacrifice. The economic exploitation surrounding these religious medical practices was breathtaking in its cynicism. Healers would demand payment not just for their services, but for various ritual objects, sacrificial animals, and ceremonial preparations that were supposedly required for successful treatment. Families facing medical emergencies would be told that their loved one's life depended on their willingness to pay whatever was demanded, regardless of their ability to afford it. The most unscrupulous healers developed elaborate schemes to extract maximum payment from desperate families. They might claim that a patient's condition required rare and expensive imported materials, or that the gods demanded specific types of sacrificial animals that could only be obtained at great cost. By the time the patient died, which was almost inevitable, the family would often be completely bankrupted, while still owing additional debts for the failed treatment. The documentation systems used by Viking healers were designed to obscure rather than illuminate the true nature of their practices. Rather than keeping records of patient outcomes or treatment effectiveness, healers maintained elaborate accounts of ritual compliance and spiritual significance that made it virtually impossible to evaluate their actual medical performance. These records focused obsessively on details like the proper arrangement of ceremonial objects and the correct pronunciation of ritual incantations, while crucial information like patient survival rates was either ignored completely or buried beneath the layers of mystical interpretation. The competitive dynamics between different Viking healers created additional pressures that pushed medical practice toward ever greater levels of brutality and spectacle. Healers would compete with each other to develop the most impressive and elaborate procedures, not because these procedures were more effective, but because they attracted more attention and commanded higher fees. This professional rivalry led to an arms race of medical horror, where healers constantly tried to outdo each other with increasingly complex and dangerous innovations. The pressure to innovate and impress led some healers to experiment with procedures that were so bizarre and dangerous that they defied all logic. Archaeological evidence suggests that some practitioners attempted to perform brain surgery using heated metals, to transplant organs between different patients, or to treat internal injuries by deliberately introducing infections that were supposed to fight the original disease. These experimental procedures were often presented as ancient techniques that had been revealed through divine inspiration, lending them an authority that made it difficult for anyone to question their legitimacy. The seasonal cycles that governed Viking medical practice created additional opportunities for exploitation and abuse, as healers learned to manipulate the timing of treatments to maximize their profits and minimize their accountability. Certain procedures would be declared appropriate only during specific times of the year, forcing patients to wait months for treatment while their conditions worsened. During these waiting periods, healers would often prescribe expensive preparatory treatments that were supposedly necessary to prepare the patient's body and spirit for the eventual surgery. These preliminary procedures might include dietary restrictions that left patients weakened and malnourished, ritual scarifications that created additional wounds and infection risks, or the consumption of toxic substances that were claimed to have purifying effects. By the time the patient was finally deemed ready for the main procedure, they were often in worse condition than when they had first sought treatment. The months of preparatory abuse would have weakened their immune systems and reduced their chances of surviving whatever surgery was eventually performed. The international networks that connected Viking healers with practitioners from other cultures created opportunities for the development of hybrid procedures that were more dangerous than any single medical tradition. When Viking healers encountered foreign medical techniques, they would often misunderstand the underlying principles while focusing obsessively on the most dramatic and impressive aspects of what they observed. This led to the creation of fusion procedures that combined Viking brutality with foreign complexity, producing treatments that were guaranteed to fail in spectacular and painful ways. A Viking healer might observe a Byzantine surgeon performing a delicate eye operation and decide to replicate the procedure using Viking tools and techniques, creating a hybrid surgery that retained all the risks of both medical traditions while providing none of the benefits of either. These international medical exchanges also created opportunities for cultural one-upmanship, where healers would claim to have learned secret techniques from distant lands, regardless of whether they actually understood these procedures or had any training in performing them safely. The preservation and transmission of medical knowledge in Viking society was hampered by the same ritualistic thinking that plagued their actual medical practice. Rather than focusing on practical information that might improve patient outcomes, Viking medical texts and oral traditions emphasized mystical aspects of healing that had little connection to effective treatment. This meant that each generation of healers inherited not accumulated medical wisdom, but an increasingly elaborate collection of superstitions and dangerous practices that had been passed down without any critical evaluation. Techniques that consistently killed patients were preserved and transmitted with the same reverence as procedures that occasionally produced positive results, because the focus was on maintaining traditional practices rather than improving medical outcomes. The result was a medical system that actually became more dangerous over time, as each generation of healers added their own innovations and interpretations to an already deadly collection of procedures. Rather than learning from the failures of their predecessors, Viking healers treated past disasters as learning experiences that required them to perform the same procedures with even greater ritual precision. The gender dynamics within Viking medical practice created additional layers of horror that affected both male and female patients in different but equally devastating ways. Female healers often specialized in women's medical issues, but their understanding of female anatomy was so distorted by cultural beliefs and superstitions that their treatments were frequently more harmful than helpful. Women seeking medical care for reproductive issues would often be subjected to procedures that were based on the belief that female organs were fundamentally different from and inferior to male anatomy. This led to treatments that involved deliberate trauma to reproductive organs, the insertion of foreign objects into body cavities, and the use of caustic substances that were supposed to purify or strengthen female tissues. Male patients faced their own unique horrors, particularly when seeking treatment for injuries to their reproductive organs. Viking culture's emphasis on masculine strength and sexual prowess meant that any injury to male genitalia was considered not just a physical problem, but a spiritual crisis that required elaborate and often mutilating treatments designed to restore the patient's masculine essence. The tools used for these gender-specific procedures were among the most horrifying implements in the Viking medical arsenal. Archaeological evidence reveals specialized instruments designed for internal examinations and manipulations that would have caused tremendous trauma and virtually guaranteed serious infections. These tools were often used repeatedly on multiple patients without any cleaning or sterilization, spreading disease and contamination throughout entire communities. The training of healers who specialized in gender-specific medicine involved additional forms of psychological conditioning that were designed to overcome normal human reluctance to inflict intimate violence on vulnerable patients. These specialists underwent extended apprenticeships that included practice on animals, corpses, and eventually living patients, learning to perform procedures that required them to ignore both their own human instincts and their patients' obvious suffering. The social pressures surrounding gender-specific medical treatment created situations where patients felt compelled to undergo dangerous procedures rather than face the shame of being seen as unwilling to endure necessary treatment. Women might submit to mutilating gynecological procedures because refusing treatment would be interpreted as evidence of moral weakness or spiritual corruption, while men would agree to genital surgery rather than risk being seen as cowardly or unmanly. The religious justifications for these gender-specific treatments were particularly cruel, as they were often presented as necessary for maintaining proper relationships with gender-specific deities, or for fulfilling cultural expectations about masculine and feminine roles. Patients would be told that their medical problems were evidence that they had failed to properly embody their gender roles, and that the treatments were necessary not just for physical healing, but for spiritual redemption. The economic aspects of gender-specific medicine created additional opportunities for exploitation, as healers could charge premium prices for treatments that were supposedly tailored to the unique spiritual and physical needs of male or female patients. These specialized procedures were often more expensive than general medical treatments, but they were also more likely to result in complications and death because they involved intimate manipulations of delicate and vulnerable body parts. The long-term consequences of surviving Viking medical treatment were often worse than death itself, as patients who lived through the initial procedures frequently suffered from chronic pain, permanent disabilities, and ongoing infections that would plague them for the rest of their lives. The crude surgical techniques and contaminated instruments used by Viking healers virtually guaranteed that any invasive procedure would result in lasting damage, even if the patient survived the immediate trauma. Survivors of trepanation procedures often experienced chronic headaches, seizures, and cognitive impairments that made it difficult for them to function normally in their communities. The holes drilled in their skulls provided permanent entry points for infections, and many patients would suffer from recurring episodes of illness that were directly related to their surgical treatment. Amputation survivors faced even worse prospects, as the crude cutting and cauterization techniques used by Viking healers left them with stumps that were prone to infection and chronic pain. The psychological trauma experienced by medical survivors was perhaps even more devastating than their physical injuries. Patients who had endured hours of excruciating pain during conscious surgery often developed what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing nightmares, panic attacks, and an inability to function normally in social situations. These psychological wounds were compounded by the social stigma that often attached to medical survivors, as their visible scars and disabilities served as permanent reminders of their encounters with the healing arts. The families of medical patients, whether they survived or died, were also traumatized by their exposure to Viking medical practices. Parents who had watched their children undergo brutal surgical procedures carried emotional scars that affected their relationships with their surviving family members, while spouses and siblings struggled to cope with the memories of witnessing medical violence inflicted on their loved ones. The cumulative effect of these individual traumas was the creation of entire communities that were psychologically damaged by their exposure to medical horror. Viking society became increasingly accepting of violence and suffering as normal parts of life, partly because so many people had been conditioned to view extreme pain as an acceptable price for supposed medical benefits. This cultural normalization of medical violence had lasting effects that extended far beyond the immediate victims of surgical procedures. Children who grew up witnessing these medical horrors developed distorted understandings of human value and acceptable behavior, while adults who participated in or observed medical procedures became increasingly callous toward human suffering in general. The archaeological evidence for the long-term consequences of Viking medical practice is both extensive and disturbing. Burial sites throughout Scandinavia contain the remains of individuals who clearly survived surgical procedures but lived with the consequences for years or decades afterward. These skeletal remains show evidence of chronic infections, malformed healing, and progressive deterioration that can be directly linked to medical interventions. Some of the most disturbing archaeological finds are the remains of individuals who underwent multiple surgical procedures over the course of their lives, suggesting that surviving one medical intervention often led to additional procedures that were supposed to address the complications caused by the original surgery. These patients became trapped in cycles of medical violence that continued until they finally succumbed to the cumulative damage inflicted by their healers. The tools and instruments found in these burial sites tell their own horrifying stories, with many surgical implements showing evidence of repeated use and inadequate maintenance that would have made them increasingly dangerous over time. Some instruments show signs of modification and repair that suggest they were used far beyond their safe operational life, while others appear to have been deliberately altered in ways that would have made them more likely to cause tissue damage. The distribution patterns of these archaeological finds suggest that Viking medical practices were not limited to major population centers or wealthy communities, but were widespread throughout Scandinavian society. Even small rural settlements show evidence of surgical activity, indicating that the horrors of Viking medicine affected people at every level of society and in every corner of the Viking world. The preservation of organic materials in some archaeological sites has provided even more disturbing evidence of Viking medical practices, including textiles that appear to have been used for medical procedures and show staining patterns consistent with repeated exposure to blood and other bodily fluids. These materials suggest that Viking medical procedures were often performed in unsanitary conditions that would have maximized the risk of infection and cross-contamination. The human cost of Viking medical practice, as revealed through archaeological and historical evidence, represents one of the most systematic and prolonged episodes of medical violence in human history. The combination of ignorance, superstition, economic exploitation, and psychological manipulation created a perfect storm of suffering that affected countless thousands of people across centuries of time and vast geographic regions. What makes this medical disaster even more tragic is how preventable much of the suffering was. Many of the conditions that Viking healers attempted to treat would have resolved on their own, with simple rest and basic wound care, while others could have been effectively managed using herbal remedies and other traditional treatments that were already known to Viking society. Instead, patients who might have recovered completely with minimal intervention were subjected to procedures that virtually guaranteed their death or permanent disability. The Viking medical system transformed treatable injuries and illnesses into fatal catastrophes, creating suffering where none was necessary and death where life was possible. The legacy of Viking medicine serves as a powerful reminder of how medical systems can become corrupted by non-medical considerations, like profit, power, and superstition. When healing becomes subordinated to other agendas, the result is inevitably the creation of systems that harm rather than help, that exploit rather than serve, and that create suffering rather than alleviate it. The lessons of Viking medical practice remain relevant today, as they demonstrate how easily medical systems can be corrupted when they lose sight of their fundamental purpose: the relief of human suffering and the preservation of human life. The Vikings created a medical system that served every purpose except the one that mattered most, and the result was centuries of unnecessary agony inflicted on people who deserved compassion and care rather than exploitation and abuse. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this entire medical nightmare was how it was justified and perpetuated through elaborate systems of social control that made resistance virtually impossible. Viking communities developed complex hierarchies of medical authority that placed healers at the top of a pyramid of power that extended down through apprentices, assistants, and finally to the patients themselves, who occupied the lowest position in this brutal social order. This hierarchical structure ensured that questioning medical authority was not just discouraged, but actively punished as a form of social rebellion that threatened the entire community's relationship with the supernatural forces that supposedly governed health and disease. Patients who expressed doubts about their treatment could be accused of lacking faith or harboring evil spirits, while family members who questioned a healer's methods might find themselves ostracized from their community or even accused of witchcraft. The most insidious aspect of this social control system was how it turned patients and their families into willing participants in their own destruction. People who were suffering from serious injuries or illnesses were told that their recovery depended not just on submitting to whatever procedures the healer prescribed, but on maintaining complete faith in the healer's wisdom and divine connection throughout the entire ordeal. This meant that patients were required to suppress their natural instincts for self-preservation and to actively collaborate in procedures that their bodies were desperately trying to resist. They had to remain conscious and cooperative while experiencing levels of pain that would normally cause people to fight, flee, or lose consciousness, all while being told that any failure to maintain proper spiritual attitude could doom their chances of survival. The psychological manipulation involved in maintaining this level of patient compliance was extraordinarily sophisticated for a supposedly primitive society. Healers understood that people facing life-threatening medical emergencies were particularly vulnerable to suggestion and authority, and they exploited this vulnerability with techniques that would make modern cult leaders envious. Patients would be isolated from their normal support networks and surrounded by people who reinforced the healer's authority and the necessity of complete submission to the medical process. They would be subjected to sleep deprivation, dietary restrictions, and sensory manipulation that left them disoriented and dependent on their healers for basic information about their own condition and prospects for recovery. The most effective psychological control technique was the use of partial successes and near misses to maintain hope and compliance even in the face of obvious treatment failures. If a patient survived the initial stages of a procedure, this would be presented as proof that the treatment was working and that continued cooperation was essential for complete recovery. If complications developed, these would be blamed on the patient's inadequate faith or hidden spiritual contamination, rather than on flaws in the treatment itself. This created a psychological trap where patients became increasingly invested in their own suffering, believing that they had to endure whatever additional procedures were prescribed in order to avoid wasting the pain they had already experienced. The more they suffered, the more committed they became to seeing the process through to whatever end their healers deemed appropriate. The community reinforcement systems that supported these individual psychological manipulations were equally sophisticated and even more difficult to resist. Viking society developed elaborate rituals and ceremonies around medical treatment that turned individual suffering into community spectacles that reinforced social bonds while normalizing extreme violence against vulnerable people. When someone in the community required major medical treatment, this would become a social event that brought together extended families, neighbors, and community leaders to witness and participate in the healing process. These gatherings served multiple social functions beyond the supposed medical benefits, creating opportunities for political networking, religious observance, and entertainment that gave everyone present a stake in maintaining the system that made such events possible. The social pressure created by these community medical events was enormous and virtually impossible for individual patients or families to resist. Refusing to participate in or submit to community-sanctioned medical procedures would be seen as a rejection of social bonds and community values that could result in permanent ostracism or even exile from the group. Children who grew up attending these medical spectacles learn to associate extreme human suffering with positive social experiences like family gatherings, religious celebrations, and community bonding. This created psychological conditioning that made it difficult for them to recognize medical abuse when they encountered it as adults, because their earliest memories associated such experiences with love, belonging, and social approval. The economic systems that supported Viking medical practice were designed to create financial dependencies that made it difficult for communities to abandon dangerous medical practitioners, even when their incompetence became obvious. Healers typically required payment not just for their direct services, but for the various materials, assistance, and facilities that were supposedly necessary for effective treatment. This meant that communities had to invest significant resources in maintaining medical infrastructure that was specifically designed to support Viking healing practices. Once these investments had been made, abandoning the system would mean accepting the loss of substantial community resources, creating powerful economic incentives to continue using dangerous medical services, rather than admitting that the entire system was flawed. The most successful healers learned to create additional economic dependencies by training local assistants and apprentices who would have no other means of supporting themselves if the medical system were to change. These secondary practitioners became powerful advocates for maintaining traditional medical practices, not because they believed these practices were effective, but because their own economic survival depended on the continuation of the system that employed them. Healers also created economic relationships with suppliers of medical materials, ritual objects, and sacrificial animals that gave these merchants financial interests in promoting continued demand for elaborate medical procedures. This created networks of economic stakeholders who would actively oppose any changes to medical practice that might reduce demand for their products and services. The religious integration of Viking medical practice created perhaps the most powerful obstacles to reform or improvement, as medical procedures became inseparably linked with core spiritual beliefs that defined Viking cultural identity. Questioning medical practices meant questioning religious doctrine, which in turn meant challenging the fundamental worldview that held Viking society together. This religious integration was so thorough that many Viking communities literally could not conceive of alternative approaches to medical treatment without abandoning their entire spiritual and cultural framework. Medical procedures weren't just practical interventions designed to treat disease and injury. They were sacred rituals that maintained the community's relationship with the supernatural forces that governed all aspects of life. The most sophisticated aspect of this religious integration was how it incorporated medical failure into the theological framework in ways that actually strengthened rather than undermined faith in the system. When patients died during treatment, this wasn't seen as evidence that the medical procedures were flawed, but as proof that the spiritual forces involved were too powerful and complex for ordinary humans to fully understand. Each medical disaster became an opportunity for deeper religious reflection and more elaborate spiritual preparation for future medical interventions. Rather than leading to skepticism about medical practice, treatment failures led to increased investment in the religious aspects of healing, creating cycles of escalating spiritual complexity that made the medical system even more dangerous and expensive over time. The geographic spread of Viking medical practices created additional obstacles to reform by establishing these dangerous techniques across such a wide area that no single community could abandon them without becoming isolated from the broader cultural network that defined Viking identity. Communities that attempted to develop alternative medical approaches would find themselves cut off from trade relationships, marriage alliances, and political connections that were essential for survival in the medieval world. This geographic entrenchment meant that Viking medical practices became self-perpetuating across entire regions, with each community reinforcing the other's commitment to maintaining traditional healing methods regardless of their obvious failures. The system became too big and too widely distributed to fail, even though it was failing individual patients on a constant basis. The most tragic aspect of this geographic spread was how it prevented the kind of local experimentation and innovation that might have led to genuine medical improvements. Communities that might have been willing to try alternative approaches to healing were prevented from doing so by the need to maintain compatibility with the medical practices used by their neighbours and trading partners. This created a situation where the worst aspects of Viking medical practice were preserved and transmitted across vast distances and long periods of time, while any potentially beneficial innovations were suppressed or abandoned because they didn't fit within the established framework of acceptable medical practice. The documentation systems used by Viking medical practitioners were specifically designed to prevent the kind of critical evaluation that might have led to improvements in patient care. Rather than maintaining records that would allow for systematic comparison of treatment outcomes, Viking healers kept elaborate accounts of ritual compliance and spiritual significance that obscured rather than illuminated the actual effectiveness of their interventions. These documentation practices served multiple functions beyond simple record keeping. They provided legal protection for healers by creating official accounts that emphasize the proper performance of established procedures while downplaying or ignoring negative outcomes. They also served as training materials for apprentice healers, teaching them to focus on ritual precision rather than patient welfare. Perhaps most importantly, these documentation systems created the appearance of scientific rigor and systematic knowledge while actually preventing the accumulation of useful medical information. The elaborate detail devoted to ceremonial aspects of treatment created an impression of sophisticated medical practice that helped maintain public confidence in the system while concealing its fundamental incompetence. The preservation of these medical records across centuries has provided modern researchers with detailed information about Viking healing rituals and procedures, but virtually no useful data about patient outcomes or treatment effectiveness. This documentation strategy was so successful that it has continued to mislead scholars about the nature of Viking medical practice, with some researchers interpreting the elaborate ceremonial descriptions as evidence of advanced medical knowledge, rather than recognizing them as sophisticated systems of professional protection and public deception. The training systems used to educate Viking medical practitioners were perhaps the most diabolical aspect of the entire system, as they were specifically designed to produce healers who were psychologically incapable of recognizing or responding appropriately to patient suffering. These training programs didn't just fail to teach effective medical techniques. They actively destroyed the normal human empathy and critical thinking skills that might have led practitioners to question or improve their methods. The systematic destruction of empathy began in early childhood and continued throughout the entire educational process, using techniques that were specifically designed to break down normal emotional responses to pain and death. Young apprentices were exposed to increasingly disturbing scenarios in carefully controlled sequences that gradually desensitized them to human suffering, while reinforcing their dependence on authority figures for guidance and approval. By the time these apprentices became full practitioners, they had been transformed into individuals who could inflict tremendous pain and witness horrific suffering without experiencing any of the emotional distress that would normally motivate people to seek better alternatives. They had been trained to interpret patient screams as evidence that treatment was working, and to view deaths as proof that spiritual forces were too powerful for medical intervention to overcome. The most insidious aspect of this training system was how it created practitioners who were genuinely convinced that they were providing beneficial care to their patients. These healers weren't cynical charlatans who knew they were causing harm. They were true believers who had been systematically conditioned to interpret evidence of treatment failure as confirmation that their methods were correct and that they needed to apply them with even greater intensity. This psychological conditioning was so thorough that it created healers who were literally incapable of learning from experience in any meaningful way. They could witness treatment after treatment result in patient death and disability, but their training prevented them from interpreting these outcomes as evidence that their methods were flawed. Instead, each failure reinforced their conviction that the spiritual forces involved in healing were complex and powerful, requiring even greater skill and dedication to master. The social dynamics surrounding Viking medical training ensured that this system of psychological conditioning would be preserved and transmitted across generations without modification or improvement. Communities invested enormous resources in training medical practitioners, and they had powerful incentives to believe that these investments were producing competent healers rather than acknowledging that they were creating dangerous sociopaths. The apprenticeship system also created powerful emotional bonds between master healers and their students that made it virtually impossible for apprentices to question or criticize the methods they were being taught. Students who had spent years learning complex procedures and ritual protocols had enormous psychological investments in believing that their education was valuable and that their masters were wise and competent. The competitive dynamics between different healing traditions and schools created additional pressures that pushed medical training toward ever greater levels of brutality and complexity. Training programs competed with each other to produce healers who could perform the most impressive and elaborate procedures, leading to an escalation of dangerous techniques that prioritized dramatic impact over patient welfare. The international aspects of Viking medical training created opportunities for even greater horrors, as different training traditions were combined and modified in ways that produced hybrid educational systems that were more destructive than any single approach. When Viking training methods encountered foreign medical education systems, the result was typically the adoption of the most dangerous and authoritarian elements from each tradition, while abandoning any beneficial aspects that might have promoted critical thinking or patient-centered care. The legacy systems that emerged from Viking medical training continue to influence medical education in subtle but important ways even today. The emphasis on ritual precision over outcome measurement, the prioritization of professional authority over patient welfare, and the systematic suppression of empathy in favor of clinical detachment all have roots that can be traced back to the psychological conditioning techniques developed by Viking medical trainers. Understanding these historical connections is crucial for recognizing and addressing similar problems in contemporary medical systems, where the same fundamental tensions between professional authority and patient welfare continue to create opportunities for systematic abuse and neglect. The Viking experience demonstrates how easily medical training can be corrupted when it loses sight of its fundamental purpose and becomes focused on maintaining professional hierarchies rather than developing genuine healing skills. The economic exploitation that characterized Viking medical practice reached levels of sophistication that rivaled the most cynical modern insurance scams, with healers developing elaborate schemes to extract maximum payment from desperate families while providing services that were virtually guaranteed to fail. These economic systems were so effective that they created sustainable business models based entirely on human suffering and medical incompetence. The most successful Viking healers understood that their income depended not on achieving positive patient outcomes, but on maintaining the appearance of providing valuable services while creating dependencies that would generate ongoing revenue streams. They learned to diagnose conditions that would require extended treatment protocols, to prescribe procedures that would create complications requiring additional interventions, and to structure their services in ways that maximize payment while minimizing their own legal and social risks. The pricing strategies used by these medical entrepreneurs were particularly cruel, as they were specifically designed to exploit the emotional vulnerabilities of families facing medical emergencies. Healers would often provide initial consultations at relatively low cost, using these sessions to identify families with significant resources that could be extracted through escalating treatment demands. Once a family was committed to a treatment protocol, healers would gradually increase their demands for payment, claiming that the patient's condition was more serious than initially diagnosed, or that the spiritual forces involved required more expensive interventions than originally anticipated. By the time families realized that they were being systematically exploited, they had already invested so much in the treatment process that abandoning it would mean accepting the loss of everything they had already paid. The most sophisticated healers developed elaborate schemes for extending treatment over months or years, creating ongoing revenue streams that could support luxurious lifestyles while providing families with just enough hope to prevent them from seeking alternative care. These extended treatment protocols typically involve cycles of apparent improvement, followed by dramatic setbacks that required emergency interventions, creating emotional roller coasters that kept families psychologically invested in continuing to pay for services. The financing mechanisms that supported these extended treatment protocols were particularly predatory, with healers offering credit arrangements that trapped families in cycles of debt that could extend for generations. Families who couldn't afford immediate payment for expensive procedures would be offered the opportunity to pay over time, with interest rates and penalty clauses that virtually guaranteed they would never be able to complete their payments. These debt relationships created additional forms of social control that made it even more difficult for families to question or abandon dangerous medical treatments. Families who owed money to healers were vulnerable to public shame and legal action if they failed to continue making payments, while healers could use the threat of debt collection to silence criticism and prevent negative testimonials from reaching other potential patients. The insurance and risk-sharing mechanisms that developed around Viking medical practice created additional opportunities for exploitation, with healers developing schemes that socialized the costs of medical treatment while privatizing the profits. Communities would be encouraged to contribute to collective funds that would support medical care for their members, but these funds would typically be controlled by healers who could manipulate them to serve their own interests. The accounting and auditing systems used to manage these collective medical funds were deliberately opaque and complex, making it virtually impossible for community members to determine whether their contributions were being used appropriately or whether the medical services being provided were actually worth their cost. Healers who controlled these funds could divert resources to their own use while claiming that high costs were necessary to maintain the spiritual purity and professional competence required for effective healing. The marketing and advertising techniques used by Viking healers to attract patients and maintain their reputations were remarkably sophisticated for their time, involving elaborate public relations campaigns that emphasized dramatic successes while concealing systematic failures. Healers understood that their success depended on maintaining public confidence in their abilities, and they developed comprehensive strategies for managing their public image, regardless of their actual performance. The most effective marketing technique was the strategic use of testimonials from satisfied customers, with healers carefully selecting and promoting cases where patients had experienced positive outcomes, while suppressing information about the much larger number of cases that had resulted in death or disability. These testimonials were often embellished or fabricated entirely, creating false impressions of medical competence that attracted new patients while concealing the true risks of treatment. Healers also learned to exploit the natural human tendency to remember dramatic events more vividly than routine occurrences, staging elaborate public ceremonies around their rare successes, while ensuring that their numerous failures occurred in private settings where they were less likely to be remembered or discussed. This created systematic distortions in public perception that made dangerous healers appear more competent than they actually were. The professional networking systems that connected Viking healers created additional opportunities for market manipulation, with groups of practitioners working together to maintain artificially high prices while suppressing competition from alternative healing approaches. These professional associations would establish standard fee schedules, divide up geographic territories, and coordinate marketing efforts in ways that maximize their collective profits while minimizing patient choice. The most sophisticated aspect of these professional networks was how they used their collective influence to shape legal and regulatory frameworks in ways that protected their interests, while making it difficult for patients to seek redress for medical injuries. Healers would use their relationships with political and religious leaders to ensure that medical malpractice was difficult to prove and that successful practitioners were protected from criticism or legal action. The international trade networks that connected Viking communities created additional opportunities for medical fraud, with healers claiming access to exotic treatments and rare materials that commanded premium prices, while providing no additional medical benefit. These international connections allowed healers to create artificial scarcity around common materials, while claiming that their treatments were based on advanced foreign knowledge that justified extraordinary fees. The most cynical healers would import worthless substances from distant lands and present them as powerful medicines that were worth enormous sums, while also claiming that the rarity and expense of these materials proved their effectiveness. Patients and families who paid these inflated prices were actually subsidizing elaborate deceptions that provided no medical benefit while enriching healers who had no genuine expertise or foreign connections. The technological innovations that emerged from Viking medical practice were typically focused on making procedures more impressive and profitable, rather than more effective or less dangerous, with healers developing increasingly elaborate instruments and techniques that served primarily as marketing tools rather than genuine medical improvements. These technological developments created the appearance of medical progress while actually making treatments more dangerous and expensive. The most sophisticated medical instruments were often the most dangerous, as they were designed to perform complex procedures that their operators didn't truly understand and that patients' bodies couldn't survive. Healers would invest enormous resources in acquiring and maintaining these impressive-looking tools, then use their ownership of advanced equipment to justify charging higher fees while providing treatments that were more likely to kill patients than simpler alternatives. The research and development efforts that produced these technological innovations were focused entirely on creating dramatic visual and psychological effects rather than improving patient outcomes, with healers collaborating to develop procedures that would impress audiences and justify premium pricing while ignoring any considerations of safety or effectiveness. This created systematic incentives for medical innovation that prioritized spectacle over substance and profits over patient welfare. The quality control and safety monitoring systems that were supposedly designed to ensure the competence of Viking medical practitioners were actually elaborate facades that served to legitimize dangerous practices while providing no meaningful protection for patients. These regulatory frameworks were typically controlled by the same healers whose practices they were supposedly overseeing, creating conflicts of interest that guaranteed that dangerous practitioners would be protected rather than disciplined. The certification and licensing systems that determined who could practice medicine were designed to maintain professional monopolies rather than ensure competence, with established healers using regulatory mechanisms to exclude potential competitors while protecting their own members, regardless of their actual performance. These professional gatekeeping systems created artificial scarcity in medical services that allowed incompetent practitioners to charge premium prices while facing no meaningful competition from alternative approaches. The peer review and professional oversight mechanisms that were supposedly designed to maintain medical standards were actually systems of mutual protection that ensured dangerous practitioners would be shielded from criticism and accountability. Healers understood that their collective interests were best served by protecting each other from external scrutiny, regardless of how many patients were harmed by incompetent or fraudulent practices. The documentation and record-keeping requirements that were imposed on medical practitioners were designed to create the appearance of systematic oversight while actually providing legal protection for healers who followed established protocols regardless of their outcomes. These documentation systems focused on demonstrating compliance with ritual requirements, rather than tracking patient welfare, creating comprehensive records that concealed rather than revealed the true extent of medical incompetence and abuse. The continuing influence of Viking medical practices on contemporary healthcare systems represents one of the most disturbing aspects of this entire historical episode, as many of the fundamental problems that characterized Viking medicine continue to plague modern medical systems in subtle but important ways. The prioritization of professional authority over patient welfare, the emphasis on impressive procedures over effective treatments, and the systematic exploitation of patient vulnerability for financial gain all have clear parallels in contemporary medical practice. Understanding the historical roots of these problems is essential for recognizing and addressing them in modern contexts, where the same fundamental tensions between healing and profit continue to create opportunities for systematic abuse and neglect. The Viking experience demonstrates how easily medical systems can be corrupted when they lose sight of their fundamental purpose, and how difficult it can be to reform systems that have become entrenched through economic, social, and psychological mechanisms that serve the interests of practitioners rather than patients. The lessons of Viking medical practice remain painfully relevant today, serving as a warning about the dangers of allowing medical systems to be dominated by considerations other than the relief of human suffering and the preservation of human life. When healing becomes subordinated to profit, power, or professional prestige, the result is inevitably the creation of systems that harm rather than help, that exploit rather than serve, and that perpetuate suffering rather than alleviate it.